Welcome to this webinar on the introduction to growth through adversity and the question, can we grow rather than shrink through trauma? My name is Charlotte Copeland and I'm the Managing Director at Safe Haven. We are an organisation that specialise in crisis and disaster mental health care and look at everything from both proactive and preventative measures through to responsive and reactive solutions. So let's begin. The aims for the session. We want to first of all just look and simply differentiate stress, stressors, resistance and resilience to give some context, to look at the difference between positive and negative stress so that we could then begin to appreciate when does growth through adversity occur? When is it most likely to occur? And then we can look at simple key factors that have been shown to affect post-traumatic growth and what simple steps might assist with adapting after crisis. In order to begin, what we simply want to summarise is looking at the difference between a stressor and our stress response. Remembering that the stressor itself are those things around us that have the potential to induce the stress response within us, commonly called the fight or flight response, which is like a dimmer switch, and all of us have increased levels of stress and then decreased levels of stress all the time, whether we're having a difficult meeting or we have a very acute, fast, intense stress response if we're in something where there is threat to our life. What we know is that it's not the stressors themselves that induce the stress response. What it really is our perception of stressors. So how we perceive the stressor, the situation, our capabilities of managing that situation will determine the level of threat that we feel, and that level of threat will induce a certain level of that stress response. Now, perception, it's influenced by resistance. So think about it. When our resistance is high, when we feel capable and confident, what happens is we feel less threatened. In contrast, when our resistance is low, and this is our resistance to the stresses, what happens is it doesn't take much when we begin to feel more vulnerable. We begin to feel threat, and so that induces the stress response. Resistance and resilience are connected. So commonly when people talk about psychological resilience, they're in fact referring to both resistance and resilience, where resistance is this ability to withstand the impact of stressors and not have a stress reaction. And resilience is our ability to recover when we have had a stress reaction, when we are affected. How do we return to a healthy baseline functioning? And the same strategies that tend to work for resistance also work for resilience, and vice versa. Now, one of the things that this discussion and talk that everyone has about stressors and stress is that it can seem like stress is always a bad thing. And I want you to rethink that. You see, we do need some stress. We need, fundamentally, some adrenaline and some cortisol to get us out of bed in the morning and get us engaged in our life. Now, when we have an optimum level, a good level of that, what happens is our thinking becomes clearer, more rational. We make better decisions. We can focus our attention and concentrate for longer, and emotionally we feel better balanced. Now, that sort of optimum area is known as eustress or positive stress. Outside of that optimum window is distress. So distress can come equally from too little adrenaline and cortisol, when people feel apathetic, listless, confused, they can't concentrate, bored to quite an extreme degree. Or, which is more often what people talk about when they consider stress as a bad thing, when there's too much adrenaline and cortisol, and that is distress as well. But this time, the way that adrenaline and cortisol, they affect our functioning, and adrenaline in particular affects the brain, our focus changes. So we've got impaired selectivity. We at best can often find ourselves with compassion fatigue, disengaging, feeling like we just don't empathise with other people, and that can lead all the way through to burnout at the more extreme end. We become a lot more disorganised and erratic in how we behave. So when we consider that and we can see, okay, here is this positive stress window, and then there is distress, how might this relate to growth through adversity? Well, when we consider distress, it's in simple terms, let's consider this in low, moderate and high levels of distress. What we know is that if we have low to moderate levels of distress, if we actively engage in our coping skills, if we practice those resilience skills that we have that help to recovery, actually we increase our resistance and we increase our resilience. So when we keep control of our diet, when we keep the routine in exercise, when we manage our sleep pattern, when we do that meditation or mindfulness exercise, or as I said, go for the run or do the yoga class, when we do those things that really help, well, rather like a muscle, and that's what resistance and resilience are, you either use them or lose them. What happens is, well, we increase the resistance and resilience. But as much as it increases those skills, it doesn't actually seem to lead to real personal development and growth. For that, it would seem that where we have high levels of distress, that will lead to a very high stress response, often termed an acute stress reaction, which in the short term will generally impair resilience. So what happens if any of you have experienced a quite intense, strong, acute stress reaction? You can't keep the diet healthy or keep your exercise routine up or do the meditation practice every day. You're struggling to simply get through the day initially. And so actually we have impaired resilience initially. But what the science shows is that it's with those high levels of distress where actually that leads to post-traumatic growth and increasing our resilience overall. So it's almost as if we seem to need the pain in order to really grow and develop. So let's have a look what's meant by post-traumatic growth. This is often thought of as simply an individual's experience of positive, significant change that comes from the struggle they've experienced with something that's been traumatic for them. So remembering, whilst the experience of the traumatic situation and that acute stress response won't be pleasant or positive at all at first, it's about ultimately we can reach that position. So with post-traumatic growth, we know that the pain of this stress reaction, it triggers different thinking and emotional processes that basically lead to psychic transformation or growth. And what does that really look like? Well, how we perceive cause and effect, how we make sense of the world around us, often changes. We find new meaning in life. Often we can get a sense of purpose where there wasn't, or we didn't have one before. And because we perceive the world around us differently, we become aware of new possibilities for the future that before this traumatic experience, we actually never did see them. So what influences the likelihood that actually if we go through a traumatic experience that we could potentially then also experience post-traumatic growth? Well, we have to consider what might impede the likelihood of that happening, as well as what might foster its potential. And the science shows at the moment that there is one key factor that seems to continually impede the potential for post-traumatic growth, and that is loneliness. Now, it does talk about depression as well, but actually what they found is that the depression that may be there is the depression that comes from the loneliness, and actually it's the loneliness that exists first. And so when we look at what protective factors might help and help us foster post-traumatic growth, one of the things we will look at is the connections we have with others. So if we're going to foster post-traumatic growth, a key thing is managing expectations. So what we mean by that is understanding that we've arguably evolved as human beings to be traumatized. The stress reactions we experience, as uncomfortable as they are, actually they're normal. And just as we've been designed to be able to be traumatized, we've been designed to recover from that as well. Now, this 20-minute webinar is, we don't have time to go into the detail of that, but please just take away from this that the stress reactions you have, they are normal. Having supportive people around you is important. This isn't having lots of people around you, and nor is it any kind of relationship. It's having people around you who you can trust and who you value, who you feel are a constant that you can rely on. People who have humility and you feel that they respect your experience and they respect your perspective. That's what becomes vital. Looking and searching to find greater meaning in our interpersonal relationships, finding deeper ways that we can relate to each other helps. Encouraging ourselves to use our resilience skills to be proactive in looking after ourselves also makes a difference. And encouraging deliberate rumination, because we need to make sense of what happens. And in post-traumatic growth, there is a shift in perspective in how we perceive ourselves, others, the world. And we need to spend some time deliberately thinking through that. Now, remember, deliberate rumination is different from allowing our mind to become wild and unruly and constantly, obsessively go over thoughts without any control. That doesn't help. But if we make time to deliberately think through and try and make sense of our experience, that is helpful. And then fostering a gratitude and an appreciation of life, looking at for whatever we may have lost, because going through any kind of crisis, any kind of situation that would trigger an acute stress reaction, there's going to be loss, there's going to be change, whether that's change in the external world around us, whether that could be the loss of people we love, or relationships, or jobs, or financial or social status, whatever that is, through to slightly more intangible things, such as our belief in ourselves, our others, perhaps even our sense of control, our privacy. But what there is here is change and loss that we need to adapt to. If we can, within the loss, still within that fog, look for the things that we do have around us and find a way to be grateful for that and appreciate the things that are there, it makes a difference. And then finally, having a perspective that includes a bigger picture. So that can be a religious outlook, a spiritual perspective, but it's the idea of something beyond ourselves. So whether that is, I consider my family, my friends, my community, the world, or I see the picture across multiple generations into the future and beyond, in terms of a bigger picture beyond that, with spiritual perspectives. It's all about being able to consider more than just us. And sometimes that's really hard when we feel something has been done to us and we are the centre of that. But what we do know is that ability to shift our perspective and consider something beyond that is incredibly helpful. So, when we have a crisis, so a crisis where it's going to trigger an acute stress response, how likely are we to adapt? Well, the answer is pretty likely, in all honesty. What we do know is that, look, when we have a major stressor, so that's what we're talking about, a crisis, and then we have a high stress response, human beings, we are incredible at adapting and establishing new normals. We do it so well. But it doesn't happen instantaneously. In fact, we know it takes around 6 weeks typically. When we went through lockdown with the pandemic, most of the people that I would certainly speak to as we got to the 6-7 week period, people were saying, oh yeah, I've kind of got into a new routine, this feels good, I'm getting the hang of this, there's still some stress, but I'm much better. And that's really what we do find. So we can be hopeful that whenever we're going through uncertainty and crisis and difficulties, we will adapt, but we do also need to be patient with our ability to adapt. Now, the 3 arrows on here, 1, 2, 3, that kind of refers to almost like a 3-stage process that happens when we go through having to adapt. So I think I mentioned before, when we go through a crisis, there will invariably be change, and change equals loss. Loss of what was, pre-established norms and knowns, into a period of uncertainty where we then look to establish safety by establishing new norms. Well, we know that typically there are 3 key stages that we will go through in order to basically adapt in that 6-week period. The first one is that we naturally resist adapting. We don't want to adapt. What do you mean? Change, adapt, accept what's happened. We simply don't want to do it. There typically we will experience all of those reactions that they talk about in the grief cycle. We will experience denial and bargaining, and we'll experience the anger and depression, and we will basically often fight the desire to adapt and to change. That real resistance comes in. In all honesty, that first period is a period that's about grief and mourning. It's about acknowledging and accepting loss and facing the fact there will be change. We have to accept loss and change, and a requirement to change to something first before we will change. Then we move on to the second stage, where we have moments of acceptance that change, okay, needs to happen. Okay, this is a situation I've been through. And in that, we start to test out different strategies. We attempt to work out, well, what might work, what might be a new normal. So this is the bit where we are not wholly resistant, and we're in this testing and adapting phase. And then finally, stage 3 is where we do accept and we do adapt. We say, yes, something occurred. Now, accepting is not saying everything's okay. It's saying simply, I accept something happened, a crisis happened. I accept it's meant there are changes that have to happen. And then we adapt to them. And these are the new established norms that we put in place. So, of course, if those are the overall stages of adapting, what will actually affect our recovery? What might help us through that adaptation? I would say the first one is being willing to grieve, being willing to acknowledge the impact of a crisis. Because in acknowledging it, we will face the losses, and from that we will begin to open ourselves up to potential solutions. 3 key things I'd like to leave you with today to think about. As you go through that adapting process, consider your perspective. So consider other people. How do I feel about life or death? Or how do I find meaning in the experience that I'm having? Where is my sense of purpose? Allow yourself to reflect on that. Live in alignment with your own moral compass. So, ethics are society's rules, roles, norms. It's what society dictates is the correct way to live. This is what's okay, it's what's not okay. But beyond that, we each have to make a decision for ourselves, and those are our morals. So how do we live in alignment with our personal values and beliefs? And I would say going through any kind of crisis, it's a big check, reality check on this, and it tests us. It tests what are our true values, what do we really believe. And so being willing to look at this and being willing to make choices to live in alignment with those has a significant impact. And finally, connecting with others. We mentioned before that loneliness is the one constant that impedes the possibility of post-traumatic growth. But the connection we have with others is also our most protective factor in terms of resistance, so resisting the impact of stressors, and our most significant factor with respect to resilience, so recovering when things impact us. But this isn't about connecting with all the people we know. Actually, however many people we know makes no difference at all. It's simply about finding and recognizing the people we trust, the people we value, and who we feel trust and value us. So maybe family, you may have key friends. And also think of positive institutions, which basically means groups. And groups that have a positive impact on you and your life. Might be a sewing group or a rugby club, or it might be the community or the neighbourhood watch, through to our religious groups and institutions, academic institutions. There's lots of different groups out there where we can feel like these really are affirming and a very positive experience for me in my life. It's those that we need to seek out. Seek out these key connections, because if we're struggling, and if we're struggling after a crisis, we will want to withdraw to a degree. It's normal, it's natural, and a degree of it is okay. What we simply want to make sure is that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We realise that some connections are vital, and we are just selective, and make sure that the ones that we do use our time and energy to engage with are the ones that will have the significant impact for us. Along with this webinar today, you will find that there also is a worksheet, and there are some key questions there to get you to reflect on your stress, your resilience, your values, and things that might help for you in managing distress, whether that's low, moderate or high, and potentially look at what helps you foster resistance and resilience. So I thank you for your time today and hope you have enjoyed this webinar.